The wind swept orange leaves across the sidewalk as Thomas Grayson sat alone at his usual table on the corner patio of the cafe. His tailored suit was immaculate, his silver cufflinks gleaming in the weak autumn sun. He barely noticed the chill. His mind was deep in numbers, mergers, forecasts, investments that could shape markets. A fresh espresso steamed beside him, untouched. Waiters moved briskly around him, tending to late-lunch diners. The clang of silverware and hum of conversations created a symphony of normalcy, and Thomas was comfortably isolated in his world of wealth and precision. Then, just as his server approached with the bill, a small voice broke through the noise, quiet, almost uncertain, but clear. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Thomas looked up, momentarily annoyed at the interruption. But what he saw made his heart pause. A young girl stood before him, perhaps 10 years old, her cheeks red from the cold. She wore a coat 2 sizes too big, patched at the sleeves, and her shoes looked soaked through. But it wasn't her clothes that held his gaze. It was her eyes. They weren't pleading or ashamed. They held something deeper, something that unnerved him in a way he didn't expect. Dignity, hope, maybe even quiet defiance against the hand life had dealt her. She clutched a worn notebook tightly to her chest, her fingers pink from the cold. "I'm sorry," she added softly, sensing his hesitation. "I don't mean to bother you. I just haven't eaten since yesterday." Thomas blinked. In his world, hunger was a word in documentaries or charity events. Not this. Not a child asking politely to eat what he hadn't touched. The waitress stood still, waiting for his cue, but Thomas waved her off gently, eyes still on the girl. "What's your name?" he asked, voice lower, softer. "Lena," she replied. Without a word, he pushed the plate toward her. Not leftovers, his full, untouched meal. She hesitated, then sat slowly, lifting her small hands in gratitude. As she ate quietly, Thomas watched, not out of pity, but curiosity. Who was this child who carried herself with such quiet pride? Why did she have a notebook in her hands instead of food? For the first time in a long while, Thomas Grayson closed his laptop, pushed aside his reports, and listened, not to numbers or strategies, but to the stirring of something long buried inside him. Time seemed slow as Thomas watched the girl eat. She didn't gobble the food like he half expected. She took small bites, savoring each one as though it were a feast. Her hands, though trembling slightly from the cold, were careful and neat. It struck him. This wasn't someone used to being handed things. This was someone used to holding herself together. He had met CEOs, billionaires, senators, but never had he been so disarmed by someone so small. "You come here often?" he asked, almost amused at how awkward the words sounded coming from him. He wasn't used to casual conversation, especially not with strangers on the street. "Sometimes," she replied, wiping her mouth with the edge of a napkin. "Only when my mom's working late and I finish early at the library." "The library?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. She nodded. "It's warm and quiet. They don't mind if I stay until closing. I read, and I write." She lifted the notebook a little, almost protectively. "Stories mostly, and sometimes poems. I want to be a writer." Her voice wasn't boastful, just matter-of-fact, like she had already decided it, and the world simply hadn't caught up yet. Thomas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. He looked at her. Really? Looked. Her cheeks were smudged, her hair tucked under a wool hat too big for her head, but her eyes, those eyes, held something he hadn't seen in years. Not desperation, not pity, hope. A steady, quiet kind of hope that refused to be snuffed out by cold weather or empty stomachs. He was startled by how clearly he could see it. For a moment he forgot the numbers in his briefcase, the deals waiting for his approval, the ticking of his watch that usually governed his every hour. "What's your mom do?" he asked softly. "She cleans offices downtown," Lena said, "and sometimes waits tables at night. She's tired a lot, but she says as long as I keep learning, we're going to be okay." Thomas looked down at the silver pen in his hand, then set it aside on the table with a soft click. He wasn't sure what was happening to him, but something in this moment, this conversation, felt different, important. As if for the first time in a long while, he was exactly where he needed to be. The air had grown colder by the time they moved to a nearby park bench just across from the cafe. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long amber shadows over the sidewalk. People rushed past, bundled in coats and scarves, lost in their own lives. But on that quiet bench, time once again seemed to pause. Lena sat beside Thomas, her small frame tucked into the oversized coat he had insisted she take from his car. She clutched her notebook tightly, as if it were a piece of her soul. "May I see it?" Thomas asked gently, nodding toward the worn cover. Lena hesitated, eyes searching his face, as if weighing the risk. Then, slowly, she handed it to him, her fingers lingering on the edge for a second before letting go. He opened the cover with care, expecting scribbles or childish musings. Instead, he found page after page filled with neat handwriting, colorful sketches, and carefully plotted stories. There were tales of magical cities hidden beneath the streets, of brave girls with wild imaginations, of quiet heroes who changed the world not with swords, but with kindness. One page showed a drawing of a tall glass tower, a symbol of success, and beside it a small girl with a notebook looking up at it. Beneath it she had written, "One day I'll climb higher, not to be seen, but to help others see." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "These are incredible," he said, turning another page, stunned by the richness of her imagination. "How long have you been writing?" "Since I could hold a pencil," Lena said shyly. "I just like telling stories. They make things feel less heavy." He closed the notebook carefully, staring at the cover again. "Would you let me borrow this? Just for the night. I want to read it all, slowly." Lena's eyes widened. "You really want to?" He nodded. "Yes, every page." She bit her lip, clearly torn. "Okay, but promise you'll give it back?" "I promise," he said, placing a hand gently over the notebook like it was made of glass. For the first time that day, she smiled, a real, full smile. And in that smile, Thomas saw something he hadn't felt in years. Not charity, not pity, connection. He hadn't meant to sit here this long, but somehow, in the quiet presence of a little girl with a notebook and dreams too big for the sidewalk, he'd found something more valuable than any stock portfolio. He'd found meaning. The next day, the sky hung heavy with the promise of snow. The cafe was quieter than usual, the outdoor tables mostly empty. But Lena sat on the same park bench across the street, legs swinging, notebook absent from her hands for the first time in years. She clutched her fingers together, waiting. She wasn't sure if he'd come. Maybe he got busy, maybe he forgot. People did that sometimes. But then she saw him, Thomas Grayson, walking toward her through the drifting leaves, holding a leather satchel in one hand and a bright blue shopping bag in the other. He looked different today. Not in his suit or shoes. Those were the same. It was his eyes. Softer. Lighter. "You came back," she whispered, more surprised than she meant to sound. "I told you I would," he said, smiling. "And I brought something." He handed her the notebook first. She took it carefully, checking every edge as if making sure it had survived. "I read every page," he said, sitting beside her. "Twice." Lena blushed. "I know they're not perfect. They're honest. They're beautiful, and they deserve to be heard." He reached into the satchel and pulled out an envelope, placing it gently in her lap. "This is for you." She looked at it, puzzled, then opened it slowly. Inside was a formal letter, embossed with the seal of a prestigious private academy she had only heard of in passing. Her eyes darted across the words. Full tuition, books, transportation, meals, all covered. What is this?" she asked, voice barely a breath. "It's your future," Thomas said, emotion catching in his throat. "I started a fund, the Lena Hope Fund, not just for you, but for other kids like you. Kids who dream, who write, who hope. You inspired it." Lena stared at the paper, stunned. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He handed her the other bag, a little lighter in weight, but no less thoughtful. Inside was a thick, warm coat in her favorite shade of green, a stack of blank notebooks, new pens, and a few of her favorite snacks. He'd remembered the peanut butter crackers and read. "Licorice. I didn't know what size coat to get," he said, trying to sound casual. "But we can exchange it." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned in and hugged him, fiercely, her face buried in his chest. Thomas froze for a moment. Then he wrapped his arms around her, holding on like he was the one being saved. In that embrace, the cold seemed to fade, and something extraordinary took root, something neither of them could fully explain. But they both knew. This wasn't charity. It was hope, handed back and forth, and finally, shared. The bookstore buzzed with quiet excitement, the kind that hums beneath bright lights and the rustle of pages being turned. Rows of eager readers stretched through the aisles, clutching copies of Beneath the Sidewalk Stars, the debut novel that had taken the literary world by storm. At a signing table near the front, a young woman with rich, dark curls and a calm confidence smiled as she scribbled her name onto another title page. Lena Hope, now 20 years old, graceful, composed and radiant with purpose, handed the book back to a starstruck teen and thanked her sincerely. Behind her, a polished wooden plaque was mounted on the wall. The inscription read, "To Thomas Grayson, who saw not a beggar, but a voice." People took photos beside it, not fully knowing the story, only sensing it carried weight. But Lena knew. She glanced at the plaque between signings, every time she needed grounding or reminding. Toward the back of the crowd, Thomas stood in a simple coat, away from the spotlight. His hair had gone grayer, his steps a bit slower, but his smile, quiet and full, held something wealth could never buy. He didn't wave, didn't call attention to himself. He didn't need to. Just watching Lena was enough. A reporter nearby leaned toward him, not knowing who he was, and whispered, "She's incredible, huh?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, she always was. 10 years ago he had given her a coat, a letter, and a bag of snacks, but she had given him something far greater, a reason to care. A second chance at being human, not just successful." Now, as the line slowly moved forward and Lena's voice echoed softly through the bookstore, Thomas slipped out the side door and into the early evening air. Snow began to fall, light and drifting. He tilted his face to the sky and breathed in deep. He was no longer just a millionaire. He was a part of something lasting, something that had started not with a deal or a transaction, but with a question. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" And now, a world away from that cafe bench, her story was feeding hearts everywhere.